This is Justice Warriors, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 39. My name's Andy and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And we have the exciting privilege also to be joined by Anu. Please say hi, Anu.
Hi everyone.
Hi. So Anu is an author and theologian who's researched links between climate crisis, past and present colonialism, extractive practices. Probably haven't summarised that very well, but has written a book which is absolutely fascinating called Liberation for the Earth, Climate, Race and Cross, which is really good and I really recommend. So we've got the chance to talk to you, Anu, and find out a bit about you. So I wonder if we could start off by just asking you, could you tell us a bit about your story of faith and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. My story of faith is mostly I was born into faith. My father's Buddhist and my mother is Catholic, and so I was baptized Catholic, but I was brought up in both traditions.
Wow.
And I still, in that sense, of course, there was always that rebellious teenage phase of I don't want any of this. Mm-hmm. But as an adult, certainly particularly sort of through the sort of work I've done in terms of encountering social movements and my research and so on, I've actually come back to faith, of that particularly sort of a reconversion, if you will. And although primarily I am a Catholic, I'm also a Buddhist, and so I'm also very guided by a lot of my Buddhist principles as well. So I would say that my story of faith is a multiple one of conversion and reconversion.
Wow. And then how has that led you in your life towards the different choices that you've made in your career?
I think...
Or is it not?
I think the one thing it has pushed me toward is to refuse singularity. So I hold a few different positions. I'm very lucky to have them. I'm also very involved with different sort of movements and different sort of spaces and things like that. I think my two faiths have pushed me towards the importance of centering dialogue. Particularly not just dialogue in that sort of like one-to-one, but how important it is to be part of a collective. Having sort of grown up in a collective and having, different voices around me and reasoning things out, that sort of question answer. Once again, as an adult and in my professional and personal life, I think I find that working in community and working collectively often helps to build in ways that hopefully make things a little bit more equal around. Not always successfully, of course. There's always fragmentation when you work in the collective, but rather than having sort of an individualist perspective that is often quite myopic, the collective, I think, pushes you further than you thought you would. That's a really vague answer, sorry.
We've talked a lot on this podcast about our need to be less individualistic in the way we understand the world, but also, I personally at least, really struggle with knowing how to do that. And it sounds like some of your personal experience gives you some tools maybe to start doing it. We've also talked a little bit about Buddhist ideas, certainly without much knowledge on my part, but sometimes some of those ideas of maybe provided ways of understanding and thinking about things that could be helpful.
I'm really interested in I'm trying to imagine your kind of family home, and were differences of opinion and views kind of just ignored and sort of pushed to one side, or was it kind of talked through? Were people trying to get each other to see their own, way of thinking, or was it? I don't know. I'm just really interested how the debates around the dinner table might have gone.
Well, I mean, I think I should talk about sort of the commonalities of my parents both shared. They're both very, very social justice oriented, and so were my grandparents on both sides as well. And I think that was at the center of everything for them.
That was a unifying factor.
Yeah, that sort of trumped, I think, any sort of faith-based ideological battles, if you will. And I think so. In Christianity, we have the concept of chesed, of loving kindness, which is also a concept that you have in Buddhism. So I think compassion, metta. So these are sort of shared values that are there. I think the possibly the main difference is that in Catholicism, there's a lot of focus on the rule and the structure of worship and worship every Sunday and so on and so forth. Whereas my father's family, they always joke that they sort of follow the rituals when someone gets married or someone dies, but that's about it. So their practice is a little bit more cultural, rather than the regimentation of going to mass, and that I think guides Catholic life. So that may have been the only difference. And because of that, we were sent mostly to Sunday school, and we were brought up more specifically Catholic, but always with a sense of the Buddhist values. And we went to temple, and we observed certain practices. So it was sort of that was the negotiation of what is important in each space. But it also made for really healthy dinner conversation. Particularly my brother, sister, and I have all had phases when we were all went a bit atheist. So I think this is what I appreciate about my parents, is that they were always open to dialogue. Even if it got quite hairy, there was always dialogue around the dinner table, and I think that was important.
And that sounds really fascinating. And what was the environment like? Like, was it a context in which both religions were a minority, and therefore you had this sort of more closed community toward the outside, where you sort of singled out in a way, or was it connected to everybody else around you and their religious beliefs?
Yes, it's really interesting. So when we lived in Sri Lanka, Buddhism is the majority,
Right.
and in Sri Lanka particularly, as you might know, so there's Buddhism, but then there's a form of Sinhala Buddhism, which is essentially part of the state government, which manifests in the same way as sort of how Christianity sort of manifests in the United States, so it's very close to. So, but importantly, I want to say my father's family is not sort of allied with that. But at the same time, my father belonged to the majority community, and my mother to a minority community. Even though sort of ethnically, my mother's a bit mixed from her background. But as children, we lived a peripatetic childhood, because my father was a journalist. He was posted in many parts of Asia. And so we lived for about 4 years in Pakistan. And then, of course, both my parents' religions were in a minority because it's a Muslim country. We then lived in India, and there again, they were in the minority. So in that sense, you sort of learn, one of the things you do learn is that you learn about what are the connections between different religions and faith traditions, and once again you understand why dialogue is necessary, but you also see how religions can be so violent against each other.
Yeah.
So and it is interesting because my name, the name that I have, is a very Buddhist name,
Right.
and so when I'm in my country, in a sense, I can hide behind that if I want to, and no one knows that I have a minority belonging. But when I'm outside of my country, in say India or Pakistan, it's very vivid. Right. My sense of being a minority. As an immigrant in the United Kingdom, I can't hide that I'm a minority. So I have had the experience of being both the majority and the minority. So this really influences my thinking also. And in that, once again, why I think it's important to have as much dialogue as possible, because you sort of don't know what the complexity of someone is.
Right. Sorry if I could ask another question, but you bring up dialogue a lot, and I'm quite interested in that, because obviously there's a healthy version of that where it's communal, where it's local, day to day. You just encounter, you learn to live festivals together. Like in the settings that I study, that is what people do. but what's actually called dialogue is from the top, religious fathers getting together, being rolled out for political purposes, discussing doctrine, the kinds of things you wouldn't do around a festival or something, where you actually know how to skirt around, let's say, differences around food prescription and so on. So when you talk about dialogue, I mean, I'm making a false alternative here, but like, what sort of level are you talking about? What are the images of dialogue that you found particularly helpful in your life?
I think dialogue happens at so many different levels, and they're all equally important, because dialogue doesn't necessarily have to be about speaking. One of the things I miss the most when I live in the United Kingdom is that during festival time, as you say, for example, it was Eid just last week, and had we been living in Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan, our Muslim neighbors would come around with a plate of food. And they don't have to say anything, but that's a form of dialogue, and that's at that very, very localized level of what you're sharing. You're sharing your community. But you're right, dialogue also happens at these other levels, the sort of higher levels. And when it happens at those levels, my question there is, what is the intention of that dialogue? Because I think some religious leaders may enter into dialogue to maintain their particular position, their particular power and privilege. That doesn't mean that that dialogue is not important, but I wonder, one, like I said, what is the intention of it? And is that dialogue connected to that local level of us sharing a meal together? Sometimes it's not. That, I guess that is my not very good answer.
No, it fits exactly what I'm observing. All the questions of politics come in at that level and makes it very difficult. Yeah.
So I'm quite excited to hear you talk about a kind of reconnection, reconversion. I sometimes worry that on this podcast we're just documenting an experience of gradually fading faith. And so I'm really excited to hear you talk about a kind of reconnection, reawakening. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what that's been like for you, if it's not too personal.
No, that's quite all right. So when I was an undergraduate 150 years ago, I moved to the United States, and that's where I was pursuing my undergraduate degree. And I had such a culture shock of going from a space where the Christian community I was a part of, not only were they in the minority, but they were at the front lines of social justice. And of course, my family being quite progressive in that sense. And I went to the United States, and I encountered Christianity as a majority. Christianity is so imbricated with the state. And it was, I think my experience, I would now call it heartbreak, but then it was just profound shock to my system, and I couldn't see the God I had grown up knowing. And so I think, it was a really big sort of traumatic shock, and I retreated a lot, and I retreated from my faith, and probably quite hurtful to my parents that I didn't want to be part of that anymore, because I was an undergraduate after 9/11, and I think the generation, even still now, I think, and I was maybe several years after 9/11, but after 9/11, communities of color, particularly Islamic communities, or anyone who had a particular perspective, was labeled as a terrorist and a radical that was othered. And this was all a lot of it was coming from this kind of Christianized state. And so for all of those various reasons, it was almost impossible to see the closeness that I had felt with the divine there. And so I just disengaged fully. I just didn't want to be a part of that for the longest time. But then I was doing some research on post-conflict Sri Lanka, and I was sort of observing people rebuilding their lives and the ability to rebuild after deep trauma. And I thought, oh, there's God again.
Right.
And it was to me sort of a sign that I needed to grow up a little bit from my trauma and kind of re-enter. And for me, the re-entry was by going back to a particular kind of Christian Marxist tradition that was invested in dialogue, that was intentional about speaking truth to power, that had an image of Christ as the itinerant rabbi. And so that for me was a very, very important moment of reconversion, about saying, you know what, I should have dug deeper into this. I should have done that instead of walking away. So this was about finding Christ again, and that happened through not only my lived experience, but by encountering someone else's lived experience, and they're sort of they wouldn't talk to me about God at all, but I just sort of saw something there that I think was really profound. So there you are.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And is that kind of sort of Marxist, left-leaning, social justice kind of Christianity, is that a very visible strain of the church in Sri Lanka, or is that just something that you're picking up as sort of a bedrock of your faith?
It is something I pick up as a bedrock of my faith, but it is both visible and invisible in Sri Lanka. So if you look at at the hierarchy, the level of the hierarchy of the sort of bishops and so on, you probably wouldn't see a lot of that. But if you look at what you would call the religious community, the nuns, the sort of religious brothers and the priests and so on. For example, one of the things I talk about in my book is the resistance to the port city development, which is an ecological justice movement. And at the front lines of that, you will see nuns in full habits, and you will see priests in like the full cassock and so on. And they are, from different Christian backgrounds, and they've always been so. As in the 60s and the 70s and so on, you had the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, and one of the meetings happened in Sri Lanka. There's a few sort of Sri Lankan priests who have been excommunicated from the Catholic Church for their sort of particular Christian Marxist lines of thinking, which is important. And another thing that if you do come to Sri Lanka on May Day, there's quite a few churches who, going back to the 1960s, have these amazing May Day masses, where you'll even see people wearing, like, the stole has a sickle on it. They'll be talking about the workers and the commitment to the worker. So you do see that visibly, but there's also a hierarchical level where it is not very visible. So, yeah.
Wow, fascinating.
That is really fascinating. I've mentioned on the podcast before that I grew up in East Germany, so my experience was an antithesis of Marxism and religion in some ways. And of course, I'm familiar with liberation theology and what they're trying to do and how different it was in Latin America. I guess one of the questions that I always have in my head, though, is how do you connect this very educated, systemic critique of the world with sort of grassroots activism of poorer people? Of course, their experience of exploitation does play into it, but it often tends to be the more educated who speak out, who write the theologies, who mobilize. And then certainly in Latin America, the case was that a lot of people then turned Pentecostal away from these stronger systemic critiques. How have you been able to connect the sort of more political ideas around Marxism to the sort of grassroots activism and working with people and communities?
It's a really good question. Thank you. I think you asked the question how I connected it, and I take my example from theologians and activists who have come before, because I feel like I'm still a postulant, really. I think if I can give an example, Gail Omvet, who's written a lot about the Indian sort of labor movement and so on, she talks about how in the 1950s there was a Norwegian fishing giant that was essentially trying to sort of take over some of the fishing resources in Kerala in the south of India, and there was sort of a mass resistance to it. Some of it from, of course, the fishing community, and some of it also from these priests and nuns who were liberation theologians. And what was really and they were sort of creating these cooperatives and organizing prayer groups into pockets of labor activism. And something really interesting happened where, because of the embedded nature of the priests and nuns being in the community, it affected their theology. And so one of the nuns talks about how, instead of only, focusing in on the Latin American liberationist critique of class and labor, because of the critical collaboration that occurred in dialogue with the fishing community, the community that was experiencing that, they had to start thinking about other things. They had to start contextualizing. And then she talks about how that sort of the effect that the lived experience had is that the liberational theological discourse had to then also bring in critiques of science and technology, of environmentalist destruction, of feminist movement building. It had to bring all of these like intersections of other things coming in, because that was also what they were encountering as part of the resistance that the community itself was taking forward, as part of the lived experience that was there. Particularly particularly she said when she went to like women's prayer groups, and what were they praying about? She's like, oh, you know what? I need to shift my critique. I need to change what I'm doing. So I think sort of the answer there is that this is why I think liberation theology has a very contextual sense to it. So, and that makes sense, right? So if you look at Latin America, you have that significant critique of relentless growth, a significant critique of economics and class. And then in South Asia, you have these different levels, right? The particularly looking at, okay, how do we deal with embedded religiosity? How do we look at the question of women's rights? And so having to bring these other levels. And then in Africa, particularly in anti-colonial Africa, the building of a Pan-African movement really affected liberation theology as well. So I think the answer really is how is allowing, as a theologian, we have to do what Rosemary Radford rather says, is to let grace swell up from the ground. Yvonne Guevara says the same thing as well. Yeah. The theology only makes sense if it's affected by the embeddedness in the context, and that's what should drive the theology and influence it and give it life, because otherwise there is no life really in your theology if it's shut out to the context. And even for Christian Marxists in Asia, one of the things they say profoundly is that we have the awareness that Marx was a European, that he was speaking from his context. So there's things in what we interpret that we have to refuse.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it is that process of listening to the groundswell, and also generative refusal, if you will. I hope that wasn't too academic, Andy.
It did leave me wanting to make sure. Obviously, I know exactly what liberation theology is, but I wonder whether some of the listeners would need a definition.
Is that possible in a couple of minutes? I was just wondering, is it, or a slightly different question, what is it about liberation theology that makes it particularly suited to the process that you're describing? That might help. I don't know.
Sure. I think that for me, what's powerful about the liberationist critique or liberation theology is that it centers struggle. Right, from whether it's in the Latin American context or the African context, the Asian context, whether it's James Cone, who wrote about Black communities in the United States, because it is about what is struggle and how can theology think about what struggle is and where struggle is. And
when you say struggle, do you mean like a struggle for relief from oppression for people?
Yeah, struggle for liberation from the structures that oppress. shall we say, right? So we talk about, systemic sin. That's one of those phrases that you'll find in liberation theology. So it's talking about what are the powerful structures that cause oppression to occur. Where is power concentrated? Is a question you would have. Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, talks about the fact that liberation theology is theology you do when the sun goes down. And what he means by that is that you spend the whole day and you have that experience, and you come back and then you reflect on what you have seen, and you think about what you have seen, and then you move from there to say, okay, what is the action I'm called to do based on what I have experienced? And I think that's very powerful. In the shorthand of it, if you sort of walk around my kind of Catholic, we talk about see, judge, act, right? You see, you think about it, you analyze it, and then you move to action. And what this is really trying to say is that the practice of what we do is about being entirely in uncompromising solidarity with those who have been deliberately silenced. And then we all seek liberation together. So it's liberation for all through the embedded nature. So I talked about the embeddedness in the lived experience, and that's very important. When I talk to my students, I always give them these questions. What do we see? Why is it happening? Who holds power? And how do we redistribute power? So those are the sort of questions that I often ask my students to think about. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah. I think we've talked quite a few times about identifying who holds power. And I think that's completely changed the way I've interpreted lots of stories about Jesus, for example, because they have a completely different meaning when you're looking at effectively what power structure is he resisting when he's doing certain different actions. Thank you. That's really helpful.
I suppose, been casting my mind back. Anu, we've been doing a series on what is church and what is it for, and it just strikes me as you say that these kind of discussions about who holds power and what is it for and what are the structures and who's being silenced are almost entirely absent from our regular experience of church. When I say our, I mean mine and Andy and Jörg, the church that we all attend, and I would probably widen that out to evangelicalism as a whole. Is that a horrible sweeping generalisation? But let's say British evangelicalism. Those things feel wholly absent, and it's not that there aren't oppressed people and there aren't marginalised people, and they may not look as obviously. It might those distinctions aren't as obvious, but we're just not paying attention to them so much of the time.
Well, it's almost like there's a theological choice that those movements say, well, God has all the power and he'll fix it for you, and it's not about, that's when it gets, people wouldn't say it so up front, but this is why the earth and all of the things that happen here on earth always are a bit more in the background, because that's just the theater stage in which God's great acts are played out. But when that comes in the foreground, a different story is told. I guess in my mind, the tension then always becomes is, how do you keep sort of God's activity in the world alive, in the sense that sometimes we humans just don't manage to achieve what we set out to do. Yes, social justice has improved somewhat in Brazil, because there's now a middle class that has gotten richer on capitalistic means, where the Amazon is still being cut down, So a lot of these things just don't seem to change as we envision. And I think this is where the evangelical critique often comes in. I'm not siding with one side or the other, but I really see the hiatus here, why people would then say, well, why can't it be about me? Why can't it be about my advancement? And here I'm part of a community where we always talk about poverty and structural injustices, and the solutions we're given is we need to work on changing the system together. And in many cases where I've studied religion, people feel so disempowered that they don't even see that possibility, because the next war is just around the corner. So, again, it's something I always found very easy to imagine theological spaces, but talking to, let's say, poor people in Ethiopia, it was much further away, but there was always that sort of sense, God's going to carry me through today, no matter what comes tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, because I think we've often criticised the kind of like over-spiritualising from a position of privilege, normally. But perhaps we're missing out on where seeing the world in a spiritual way is a good and beneficial way of finding hope, if you see what I mean.
Well, and ideally you'd find places, ways and opportunities to connect those two, you know, to have a spiritual practice that looks to, there's got to be something that comes from God, because we humans are ultimately also powerless, and yet we're still meant to act, we're still meant to feed the hungry today. You know, that's the way we bring our, 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and then God does something with it. So, like, how do you connect these two strands of sort of a spiritual longing, or perhaps, charismatic Catholicism even, with liberation theology? Like, have you seen that happening in your spaces?
I think in the experience that I've had, I think there's a big disconnect between a lot of the charismatic Catholicism and the kinds of the Catholic sort of Catholicism that I live, because I think each of them focuses on something, prioritize something different. What you talk about, feed the hungry and so on, is charity. In that sense, it's that focus on charity. It's that focus on God will come and God will save me, and that sort of perhaps the subsumation to the divine in some way. But I'm trying not to be sort of cynical and biased here. But I think on sort of my side of the divide, it's about the prioritization of justice. So not the kingdom that is to come, but the kingdom we have been charged with creating, I guess. So it is, I think, two very different approaches, and I suppose that's why the Catholic Church is called the Catholic Church, because it can hold all these things, but they are in tension with each other. Certainly, I think you can see between the papacies of Benedict XVI and the papacies of Francis, you can see so vividly the two kinds of the Church. One,
and of course, to explain to the listener, I mean, the previous Pope actually was one of the sworn enemies of liberation theology and put some of these people in interdict, or mandated them to be quiet. So,
But then the current Pope is a bit different, right?
The current Pope is different. He very different. He's actually sort of centered a lot of these liberation theologians, and if you read Laudato Si, you can, I think, see how affected the Pope is by justice and also by the lived experience, because more so than I think the liberationist aspect of Francis, what he brings to his papacy and why it's sort of uncomfortable for a lot of people is that he can't take himself away from being someone who lived the life of a pastor. And I think that's what makes it uncomfortable for some people, and he's very interested in the justice element, which is why he and as a Jesuit, he's someone who the sort of Jesuit practice is to be asking questions and to go from dialogue to understanding, which means that sometimes you have to be in the sense that the previous Pope was quite strict about the faith in that sense. I think there were clear lines drawn, whereas if you're in dialogue, you can't have clear lines drawn, right? Because you're trying to figure something out. So that's, I think, the difference there.
Yeah. And what's interesting about Francis too is I think he wasn't a sort of straight-cut liberation theologian either. I mean, there was some critique against him from liberation theology, and at the same time, he's also working at sort of building a systemic home for the charismatic movement within the church. So he's in some ways trying to bring those two wings together. Obviously, that's going to have its own tensions and creaks. But
creaks is the word.
Yeah, it's, a bit like the Anglican Church, perhaps, that does the same kinds of things. But I guess, you know, I wonder, don't we need both? So, in like the thing that interests me in that is not just the fact that I study Pentecostals, I'm trying to understand their side, and I do understand their side, I think. But it's also that I think as we are faced with our evident inability to fix climate, you know, we're working toward people like, you know, those of us on this podcast try and do what we can, and yet it still seems like, you know, you feel so powerless in all of this. Is there a need to trust that there is something miraculous coming from God toward us? Not to stop the action, but to kind of bring that element back to say, you know, we need to acknowledge where we're powerless. We need to come, you know, foster that spiritual element of falling on our knees and praying for the world, even though, you know, I'm perhaps as cynical as the next guy about, you know, God coming from heaven and doing something. But there is an element of that, of the hope that projects, that doesn't leave everything in our hands and in our hand wringing, as it were.
This is a very profound question, Jörg, that you're asking me, and I wish I.
It's a wrestle, really. I'm not.
Well, I think you're right. We need both charity and justice, because charity turns your face towards where oppression has happened, and you look to it and you think, okay, well, I must help here somewhere. But justice helps you to ask the why question, right? So when I used to work for Caritas, the sort of joke we used to have is that when there's a village that has no water, everyone runs in and they want to be charitable, so they're building wells and they start, bringing in water pumps and laying lines and so on. But nobody asks the question, why is there no water here? And if you do, you might find that, like half a mile up the road, there's a Coca-Cola factory that's pumping chemicals into the water, and that's why there is no water there. So if you didn't have the impulse for charity, you wouldn't have gone to the village, but then you need to ask the justice question of why.
Yeah. Well, and I'm after a third element here, that is why would I behave like a good human being? Why wouldn't I monopolize the water? Why wouldn't I just lay the pipe to my house? So where is that moral imperative going to come from? Because systematically, I can also analyze the world and say, well, we're all doomed. I might as well just put high walls around myself. I see countries falling apart and everybody opts for personal security, personal health care, and, lives a Christian life that way, in this kind of sense of, well, I know these things are coming to an end and I'm just going to look out after myself. So where does that ethical imperative come from, other than sort of an intellectual reasoning, because that often doesn't carry through enough to people's day-to-day action? And that's where I think the evangelical sense of that you're going to have to answer to God. There's a supernatural element here, whether that's in heaven or now, that, if it goes well, if you can somehow bring these two together, it could actually help mobilize people for justice who are just wanting to go away cynically saying, well, I can analyze everything out of this, but I can't change it.
I agree. And I think my response is that, the moral imperative is there, perhaps because you're worried about meeting your maker, yes. To take it from the sort of, if I look at like Laudato Si, I think what Pope Francis talks about really importantly there is what he calls the effect of the encounter. That which is why he talks about the need for ecological conversion, right? So what happens when we, for example, you're in worship, or from a Catholic perspective, you receive the Eucharist. There must be something in that moment that affects you, that affects not only your heart, but your mind. Right. So that's not only about looking after that, the life that is to come. It's about being affected in that moment and then being sort of propelled out. So Francis talks about how the Eucharist sends you out right? And I think we can parlay that into other Christian traditions also, is that when you fall in love with Christ, if you will, when you have that loving moment, that conversion, if it should send you out into the world rather than back into yourself.
Yeah.
And maybe you need to ask the question, if you're being sent back into yourself and just to look after yourself and your property and your family, have you had that encounter? You know, I mean, that is the question that I would ask.
Yeah. That's what I mean. The sort of mystical encounter that decenters yourself, which you do need to at some extent, I think, or some people, many of us do, I think.
And it offers us potentially some hope there. If that is God coming towards us, then perhaps that offers also hope that God might come towards us as a species in the moment of our crisis.
Those who died are justified for wearing the badge. They're the chosen whites. They're justified. Those that died, they're the chosen whites.
Now, we've been talking for a long time, and I haven't yet asked you anything that's directly about the book. So I want to ask you, could you tell us, like, how the book came about, and where it came from, please.
Where did this book come from? The book came from like so many spaces. A part of it is I was really lucky to work with Caritas in Canada. The Development Peace is also what they're called, and they are a fantastic group there who work in partnership with different communities around the world, and they have a particular model of public teaching and a focus on movement, like being the movement of the people of God. And I was very, very affected, and it really sort of strengthened, my particular theology. And I was very lucky. I was working with them when they were having to do the very painful task of teaching in the Christian community in Canada about Laudato Si. And it was such a profound document.
So Laudato Si is a document written by
Pope Francis.
Pope Francis.
Yeah, about environmental justice, the ecological crisis, if you will, where he calls us to ecological conversion. And I recommend you read it, or you can. I'm sure there's a little Cliff's Notes somewhere. And the document had a profound effect on me. But one of the things that was difficult is trying to talk about these issues and seeing how people were responding sort of individually. So everyone was like, okay, well, we can change our light bulbs, or we can recycle better, or, we'll stop taking the car to church, or whatever it was. And realizing that people, and one of the things we discuss as Caritas staff is how, people sort of miss the point that it's about like the collective, that community conversion to what really are the issues, And then in my own research and also in the different sort of activism networks I'm a part of, becoming more aware of the role that multinational corporations play in extractivism, and how that really, a lot of that is possible because of the leftover sort of attitudes from the European colonial project. So there's a lot of multinationals who benefit from previous laws that haven't been changed. A lot of, elite communities in countries in the global south who are powerful because of, how hierarchies were sort of set up, and so on, as well as hierarchies that were there before. Being really affected by how many were laying down their lives. Like, there's an environmental defender killed something like every other day, particularly in, Africa and South America. Those who are defending the river and the land and the forest. And these are powerful people, and because they are powerful because of their activism, they are killed because they're going up against these multinationals. And so kind of my sadness with that, and also, like I said, experiencing different social movements. And then I was in the United Kingdom, and I was part of a roundtable on eco-theology, and there were all these conversations. Once again, I heard these conversations about, well, like our coffee cups, and oh, I'm so sad about it, and I'm so paralyzed about having to change my lifestyle. And I got, I'll be honest, like a little annoyed. And I thought, such a disconnect between someone moaning about their coffee cup, or the fact that they're going to lose the lifestyle that they used to, or the fact that sometimes I go for environmental justice movement campaigns, and everyone's talking about, oh, we're going to face food insecurity, and oh my god, there's going to be a migrant problem, resources are going to be so scarce, and you think, well, people are already like drowning and dying and starving, and you're just so worried about what is to come when it is already happening. And I felt that there was such a lack of solidarity. And I'm not the only person who writes about this. I don't think, as my book kind of shows, since at least the 50s and the 60s, theologians have been talking about this and writing about this, and it still hasn't sort of affected our conversations. And that was worrying for me, that it hasn't affected our conversations. So I wanted to write a book that gave a Cliff's Notes of some of these conversations and said, we have to be a little bit, we really need to center solidarity in what we're doing, or we're lost. So yes, the short answer is I got really annoyed in a conference, and I had to write a book.
Good.
It's a good motivation for a book.
And that fits exactly with my next question, which is, there's a couple of really interesting concepts that came out of the book for me, but I think what felt like at least the biggest thing in my mind was that our response to climate crisis or climate injustice should be rage as opposed to despair, say, or like worrying about the future, which is a really interesting point you just made. So could you explain, I guess, why rage is a valid response, and then also what that would then lead us to do?
Thanks, Andy. I've been having to answer that question all day today,
and sorry.
I'm not sure I've given anyone a satisfactory answer, but I'll try. I think rage makes you uncomfortable. Grief can make you uncomfortable, but grief, in my analysis at least, is an inward-looking emotion. Oh, what is it I have lost? What is it I am going to lose? Rage, I think, is an epistemic, an emotion of the intellect that can raise your face up and send you out, because you are motivated to say there must be something to do. So you're not in grief for the loss of your car or whatever it is, but you're thinking there's something that we must do. And if we look at the Christian tradition, it is full of prophetic rage. It is full of different voices, including the perpetual agitator and itinerant rabbi that we profess to follow, who are unhappy with the situation that they see around them, not their own personal situation, but the collective situation, and they are unwilling to let it go. And they say, you know what, we have to be attentive. From the perspective I come from, I think that rage helps you to be attentive. Okay. It is a kind of a starting point for action. And maybe you'll move into different emotions, or you'll move into a different space. But rage helps you it sustains you, I think, and it helps you to have those uncomfortable conversations. But also, you're not just focused on your own pain. You are turning and being attentive to say, oh my goodness, look at what's happening over there to that community. Look at the young women who have been shot by mercenaries hired by a mining company because they dared to act against the closure. Because when you see that happening, you should be angry, actually. You should be saying, this is not the kingdom that God spoke about. This is not why he sent his only son.
Yeah.
Right? You should be enraged at the loss of life, the loss of land, of air, and say something must change. And what do we need to do to change it? Who is it? What is it? Or what conglomeration of structures are causing something, and how do we take them down? I think that's a question that we have to ask as Christians. How do we take this down? And what do we need to do to that? It's justice articulated as prophetic rage, and that means that theology is not only for academics sitting in nice little rooms somewhere, but that theology is about being a movement of the people of God, right? And also, you look at scholars and activists, particularly those from the Global South, and they will say, you can't just stay in your suffering, you have to do something. And rage perhaps can sustain you to do that. I really like this quote from Farhana Sultana, who is a climate geographer, and she says, we, those of us in the Global South, we do not have the luxury of wallowing in our suffering. We resist, survive, and collectivize. And in that, I see such a deep sort of sense of rage and understanding. I've also got another, if you don't mind, a quote from Frida Hudson, who's the chief of the Unistoten clan in the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And they say, you got to understand our frustration. We've been here since time immemorial, before anyone came to these lands, and your law can bend the rules to let somebody come and destroy our land. They get you guys to help them. If it was your house, you'd feel the same if the same vandals kept coming and wrecking your shit and nobody's doing anything. And for me, that speaks so prophetically. She's not speaking theologically, but it speaks so prophetically to the kind of rage that's being articulated. That is the rage. Like, if you speak to environmental defenders, or you speak to people in social movements, if you speak to those with the front lines of this at the Global South, yes, they're sad and they're lamenting, but they're also angry. And that is anger that, like I say, go back to the 50s, the 60s, go look at the document from the Filipino bishops that Andy might give us a quote from later. And there's lament there, but there is anger. There's like, this is not what we envisioned. So I think it's important to encounter that.
And what do you think are the structures and organisations that can bring those two things together? I'm just thinking, going back to the Marxist sort of side of things. Obviously, you had this huge, great big international workers' movement in the the 50s to 60s, and it feels now that we do kind of lack that, those organisations, those things that bring people into dialogue, that ridiculously in a world that's so connected, that actually connect people directly with those frontline activists, with those of us who are sitting at home hand-wringing and feeling sad.
I think there's lots of ways to look at that question. Thank you, Leah. I think one of the biggest issues, I think, is that we have lost that sense of internationalism as we have progressed, I think, globally to be more protectionist in terms of the nation state and so on and so forth. There's been a sense that we can't have that sort of international sense together, because it has to be about the countries that we live in and protecting them. And some of that has happened in practical senses, because some countries have become poorer and poorer, and there hasn't been, I think, the kind of solidarity that you would have from wealthier nations. Also, if you look at you can talk about a country being poorer, but you'll see that there's a 1% that's mega wealthy and living in a certain way. And what happens then is, what is it that you see? You start wanting that level of richness, that kind of lifestyle, and that takes you, I think, away from the community. So there's these organic things that have happened in the world, but there's also what in the UK there's a theorist, an anti-racist thinker, A. Sivanandan. And he's written a text called Communities of Resistance. And one of the things he charts in that is how the sort of neoliberalization of protest and of movement building figured out that the best way actually to fragment the left was to separate us out into our different kind of silos, so that you stop thinking that because you're agitating on gender rights, you can't be also agitating at the same time for, labor rights, right? Or so there's a way in which, and also one of the things it did in particularity is that it separated communities of color from working class communities, as if there's no working class people in communities of color, for example, right? So that was a very successful sort of division of that. Of course, we have people like Kimberly Crenshaw, who's come back and said, we have to remember the intersectionality is a struggle where, people hold different identities and so on, but that's not been so successful because we've all started sort of competing against each other in the whole rights discourse. And I think that's really broken internationalism in a sense, right? And it's also about, if you think about the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, we wouldn't use the word third world now because we think it's the pejorative. But at that time, it was seen as this third something, a new world, another project away from the first and second world that were in a Cold War against each other. This was a reimagined coming together of Latin America and Africa and Asia to say, we don't need any of that. We can build something together in solidarity. But what do we have now? We have the fact that that phrase, the third world, is now used as the pejorative as if it means something bad. But it meant something beautiful and new and rich. So I think really what's happened is that through different levers, that sense of the international has been broken apart. I don't know what to say, it's funny or sad or rage-making for me, is that somehow the right wing has figured out how to be in global solidarity with each other, but the left has completely lost it. And I really wish I could understand how that works. But somehow the sort of more fundamentalist right-wing elements, particularly of Christian circles, have figured out through either money or networking that it is possible to be internationalists, and they are building quite a significant movement. So maybe it's time for the left to reclaim that.
The thing is, you're in the right because you like structures of hierarchy and order and people being in charge. And if you're in the left, then you generally don't. So one automatically sticks together, and the other one automatically falls apart.
Well, but it's also. I mean, there is a way in which
that's a flippant answer to a complicated question.
Yeah,
it is a complicated question.
I mean, an equally flippant response would be if you feed on fears and resentment, it's easier to do than on hope. This idea that, you somehow can unite and create a better world. Again, coming back to the East German experience, there were exactly people, around the time of the wall coming down, trying to figure out this sort of third space. And they were the ones who had basically engineered the peaceful revolution. And within a few months, people were saying, we just want bananas, we want to travel, we want to live like the West. So there's a very sort of almost like an innate human gravitation toward, personal safety, accumulation against the people who look differently. So a slightly pessimistic anthropological response. But I mean, I'm really interested in this concept of rage of yours because I see the point, and I've been there myself quite a lot, especially finding myself in a privileged space where you can fly from Africa to, let's say, Germany and sit in an IC train within 8 hours, and then it's like that other world just doesn't exist. And it would fill me with so much anger. But then there's an element of despair that I can't quite shake, and how do you mobilize for that? Rage against whom? I see rage coming up in Ethiopia a lot, and we've talked about this on this podcast, but it's led to civil war type situations because everybody's raging against another monster. And of course you could say, but they're behind there's the Uber boss, there's the real monster, there's the real level, the level monster that you need to see and unite against, but that's not how it seems to happen. Or bring it closer to home, where you can get really angry about Thames Water and what it's meant to this kind of extractive water industry, until you realize it's Swedish pensioners' retirement funds that buy the stuff, right? So all of a sudden, then you come back to oh, wait a minute, maybe it's me I'm angry about. You know, the fact that you kind of buy into some of these systems and you haven't figured out how to completely build something new. So like every time I follow this path of rage, you end in these sort of weird cul-de-sacs. Maybe that's just a personality thing that I'm less hopeful about the sort of reconstruction of a new world.
Yeah.
Yes, Andy and Leah know that already about me, but yeah.
I
He hasn't mentioned death yet, though, has he?
Well, I've been waiting for Jörg to remind me of my death. That's what he normally does on the podcast.
Yeah.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. And now
I wanted to come to Leah actually and say, Leah, does this rage thing connect with you? Like, I feel like sometimes you can be tempted into something you might call like irritation or something, and then at good times, what that is actually expressing some of this productive rage. Do you identify with that?
I do find it really helpful, because it's got to be something that sends you outwards and towards others. And you know, it's so interesting what you were saying, Annie, because I was reading some research this week about, we're trying to promote green jobs in the renewable sector, and I've read a piece of research just recently talking to young people about the climate and about whether these green jobs are interesting to them and what would make them interested. And again, this thing comes through of people feeling so individualistic that, like, well, actually, if I had a job where I really felt that I was making a difference, you know, don't talk to me about, you know, being in a large company where I'm part of a green finance initiative, or being a lawyer for, you know, some huge, great big organization that's trying to do something for the environment. Talk to me about my individual personal ability to change things. And if you can't give me a job that kind of offers that, then maybe I'll just concentrate on making sure I reuse my cup. And, you know, it feels we've got ourselves into this space where, yeah, we are so framed by what we can do as individuals that we need something. And I think emotion and rage has real potential to join people together. And it's just, so yes, that's what I'm saying in a roundabout way, because it saddens me that we've just got so focused in on what I do as an individual, and it's miserable, it's debilitating, it's despairing, it's miserable, and it's not going to achieve anything, and it puts us at odds and separate from the people who are experiencing the worst of the effects. And the church really needs to find some kind of a voice in that, and it worries me that individualism is as rife in the church as it is elsewhere.
I think part of the issue is that capitalism has done a very good job of co-opting the climate justice movement and made us and sold us the myth that it is our individual problem. I mean, of course, you should recycle and all that stuff. I'm not saying don't do it. Of course you should. Please don't walk around throwing plastic everywhere. That's not the message of it. But if it's only about the individual things that we are doing, it is displacing the narrative from the 100 multinationals who are constantly extracting and ruining the earth and the sea, and killing different kinds of lives, right? And it actually displaces the rage we should be having against those larger power structures, because we're so focused on the individual actions we're supposed to take, or our little communities are supposed to take. And not only that, it's so corporate now. I can't think of any company that doesn't have a green policy, that doesn't have a logo on that really nice bamboo coffee cup that you can reuse. I sometimes you walk into Starbucks and you know it's a big company that doesn't pay their workers and they don't pay tax, and also they're trying to sell you their reusable cup because they're making it only your responsibility and not theirs. And so for me, because when I look at it from a lens of rage, I turn my rage outwards.
And this leads me to like one of the really big questions I want to ask you, Annie, which is,
Gosh.
The others were just a warm up to this one.
But no, this big for me, not necessarily hard, but it is that. So when you talk about rage and you talk about solidarity as being the basis of that rage, and for me, as someone who is a beneficiary of, the British Empire and the continuing colonial things that are happening right now, it's difficult to like. Basically, I need the solidarity in order for the rage to make sense. Otherwise, it feels like I'm feeling rage with myself. But I also think the thing you were just saying it helps me as well, because there's going to be a question, but it's going to take me a while. If I think I'm tricked by capitalism into thinking that I have a lot more control than I really do, and so if I feel rage at myself for being part of a capitalist system, I miss out on the fact that there's no point in having rage at myself. What I need to do is have rage at the companies that are building mines and shooting protesters and things like that. So here's the question, something along the lines of, is it just a sort of neo-colonialist attitude to have rage on behalf of someone else, or is there some way that I can participate in a solidarity in a meaningful way?
Is the rage on behalf of someone else, or the fact that capitalism is hurting you as well?
So that's interesting. So I would definitely say things like the patriarchy are hurting me, but I feel like a beneficiary of capitalism. Maybe you can convince me.
I think that here's the thing. This is what I think, and I'm probably wrong, as I often am. But I think that the problem is this, that we have been told that there's a moral good to unfettered growth. Mm-hmm. We have been told that a particular way of living, which is extractive, is a moral good. Now, let's not get this wrong. You go to my country, or you go to, look at India and China and the way that they're kind of progressing, right? That is because there is this idea that there is a particular lifestyle, a particular way of living, a particular standard or norm that is the right way to be, right? And we've all been duped by it, right? And so you've got a cell phone, we've all got cell phones, right? Mm-hmm. Think of the minerals that are in your cell phone. That's probably extracted from some mine in Tanzania or Colombia or Brazil or something like that. So every single day of our lives, we are living that, right? So we ourselves cannot. It's almost impossible to see outside of the structure, but we are trapped in it, like a spider's web. So that is something that we need to be thinking about. How do we break out of it? But as much as that's being said, we still live very comfortable lives. You are probably not going to be shot for trying to defend a river. Probably in the United Kingdom now, with the new policing bills and so on, you might get arrested because they're arresting everybody now.
But you actually talk in your book about how someone like me might not have any fear of being arrested, which is in itself a very privileged position to be.
That's correct, yeah. But the thing is, you are probably not going to be shot for defending the river near where you live. if you wanted to go and stand outside Thames Water and make sure that and protest about it, you're probably not going to get shot. Your life isn't on the line.
Yeah.
Maybe just a black mark down in the books or something like that. So it's not about like rage on behalf of someone else. It's rage that leads you to stand in solidarity with someone else. We should be, I think that in our churches, when we have sermons on ecological justice, we should just, I would read out the names of Berta Cáceres or, Aquilo Dominguez, and who was shot just on the 15th of June 2023 in Honduras because of his he and his family are resisting an iron ore mine in Guapinol in Honduras, right? I would read out these names and I would talk about that, because I think that is what we have to do. And then we ask the question, what do we have to do to be in solidarity? And to be in solidarity is not to sort of like go on Instagram and post something, or I think there's a Gen Z sort of branding of it. It's about saying, how far can I put myself out there? How far can I say, okay, you know what? So in Tanzania, the Nara mine is owned by a British mining corporation, right? How do we expose that, or how do we, bring that into the light? Right? What do we need to do to say, you know what, this company that is listed on the London Stock Exchange is killing villagers in Tanzania? What are we going to do about that? Right? Because these people in Tanzania who are powerful, who have agency, are being deliberately silenced. You might not be. So what is it that you can do? You can also pass the mic, right? And that is my particular frustration with some of the environmental justice movements here, in that they don't pass the mic. They make it about the apocalypse that is to come and saving ourselves and our grandchildren and our grandchildren. They are not very connected to what's happening on the front lines, if you will. So my question would be, what is it that you need to do to pass the mic, to stand in solidarity? And with each, I think, church denomination, it's going to be different based on the theological approaches and so on. One of the things I would say for churches is that churches already have transnational networks, particularly churches like the Anglican Church, Catholic Church. They are global. They have networks. We can mobilize these networks. And that's something that perhaps we can do. So I don't know if that was an answer, Andy, but I tried.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of it is a genuine solidarity, and like removing the blinkers and understanding ourselves as part of a community of humans. Then almost there's no question to answer anymore if we take that on board. Obviously, the rage is there when you do that.
And I think that kind of answers to Jörg's point about feeling he gets caught in this cul-de-sac of kind of rage against yourself almost. It feels a very Christian kind of idea, this idea that we're all culpable and yet forgiven and implicated and yet set free. There's those kind of strange paradoxes maybe can help us find a way forward that is active and hopeful, rather than just feeling like, oh man, I can't do anything about it because everywhere I touch is stuff that I've benefited from the system. Maybe there's a way that allows us to forgive ourselves and ask for and repent of our implication, but yet I don't know. I'm grasping, but I think there's something there.
Absolutely, there's something there. And, of course, to use the much used line now from Audre Lorde, none of us are free until all of us are free. Right? I mean, that's the basic basis of it. And if we want to think about, okay, we have benefited from colonialism, yes. Industrialized nations have. That was the whole point of the colonial project, to build that wealth. So then you think about this. If all of this wealth is concentrated in one space, don't we have a responsibility to push for that wealth to be redistributed? That's something else you can do to be in solidarity with others. So many of the countries around the world that are experiencing the worst of the climate crisis are unable to rebuild back up because they were already quite poor in that sense, right? And there's lots of corruption in lots of systems where politicians are just making money off of people's misery. And so one of the other things we can do as churches is to support the cause for reparations. And reparations isn't only about money. Of course, money is really important. And in different countries or regions will talk differently about how they want reparations. Some will talk about finances, but it's about a very uncomfortable thing to do, not just an apology, but a recognition that something wrong was done. Mia Motley, who is she's fantastic. She speaks at the COPs all the time. I don't know if people listen to her, but she says, we just want you to acknowledge that you did something wrong, right? You need that moment of something real, and then from that, other things will flow. So reparations is not only about the financial, it is about the spiritual and the relational things that also have to happen. So this is why I talk a lot about in the book and also now, and not just me, right? Other theologians and activists talk about the need for a moral awakening, right? So that is something that has to happen, and it won't happen if we're angry with ourselves or focused on ourselves or grieving for ourselves, right? We have to say, you have to grieve for what has happened to the world. There's this image of the Buddhist monk who is standing and wiping away his tears, and someone says, "What are you crying about?" And he says, all of it. And I think that's a very powerful image for me to think with.
But do you not think the Buddhist monk includes himself in that? So, I mean, my hesitation with this is that I just think that demon sits deeper. Yes, it's easy to be raging against this abstract machine of corporates and so on, but humans are always capable of extracting from one another, whether it's corporate or whether it's cooperative. Even in the smallest cooperative, you will have people taking, sort of in these idealistic communities, very quickly, dissent will emerge about who gets what over what. So I do think we need a moral awakening, but a lot of that moral awakening has to begin with ourselves and realizing, what are we after? How can we learn to decenter ourselves from the pursuit of money, of safety, of economy? So I'm not trying to put these things in alternative to each other, but I think there is a portion where that needs to come in, because what Jesus did was part of the sort of, if I read the Death on the Cross through René Girard, so this idea of that sacrifice will make you whole because you see in the mirror of Jesus what you do, then actually part of that is about the individual. It is about helping them recognize, it's not about bringing Rome down. It's about making Jews a better people so they could live a different world. So that's the real challenge for me here, that it's too cut and dry perhaps to say, well, here are the corporates we need to be going against. Why do these corporates even exist? Why do my aspirations to have retirement pension funds, whatever, feed into the system? So, there's something profoundly wrong with the way capitalism operates that we want,
But I think that's precisely the point, though. The corporations exist because we believe that unfettered growth is a moral good, and they continue to sell us that as a moral good, right?
Did they invent that, or people? I mean, that's the thing. Like, I don't think we were simply told that or bought that, but it comes out of human desire for safety, security, being slightly better than my neighbor.
Yeah, but it is also what happened, I think, in the Industrial Revolution, isn't it? That sort of particular movement, the Enlightenment as well, in particular the move to the individual. So we have these great ages that move us towards that. Neoliberalism is just like the next stage of it, isn't it? So what we have become invested in right? So the multinationals, shall we say, are the latest iteration of whatever it is. And as you say, you're quite right. It's going to be a problem until we have that conversion experience of turning away from it. But you can't individually turn away from it. We have to collectively turn away from this. Surely that is the point, right? I mean, there's a lot of, and you're quite right, in collectives as well, this does happen, right? Which means that the movement really will not end. We have to keep mobilizing, right? And that's why I think having a little bit of anger all the time, being uncomfortable all the time, and asking those questions all the time is what's really important. We cannot lose that sense, that the dynamism of movement, the dynamism of questioning things that are given to us as good. What did the Enlightenment do but give us a sense of who or what is allowed to be human, who or what is allowed to have legitimate knowledge?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Enlightenment is contemporaneous with colonialism and slavery.
Exactly.
I mean,
what was the pushback against that? Not much, because it worked really well for how wealthy, the industrialized nations became, and also if you look at the previously colonized nations, it worked really well for the elites who were there, because there was collusion between the elites and the colonialists, and everybody did really well out of that, right? So this is the thing, is that if we don't have cultures of resistance, we have the problem. But cultures of resistance must be collective, right? So I'm agreeing with you. I hope, or I hope you think I am. Is that this is the central point, to be agitators, and yes, Christ was about reforming, social reform, perhaps in the Jewish community, but not necessarily. I think he was reminding them of perhaps something that had been lost. And he is someone who is standing against the system. He is standing against empire. I think that's really important. And if you look at it from a liberationist perspective, what the liberationists would say is that the context of the Lord's Supper is that within 48 hours of that, more or less, Christ is executed as a political prisoner by empire.
That's true, and that's where the resurrection comes in, that sort of totally unbelievable, outlandish story of him still being alive, even though empire killed him, and then still not raging against empire, but forming this underground community, as it were, that lives a different life, because it begins with people turning away from themselves and turning toward neighbor. So it is a social-political revolution, but it doesn't attack
But isn't building that underground community and living in the way they did refusing empire? They're not living in the way that they were supposed to live. They refuse that.
Yeah, that's the point.
Right?
It's refusing empire. It's
refusing empire, right? And refusal, and you can't do that if you didn't have that. They couldn't have done that if they weren't in community, I think. On his own, Peter would have been like, eventually he is crucified upside down. On his own, one of my theological professors used to be like, Peter's a really stupid guy. But he had the strength in community.
Right, I need to stop this extremely interesting argument.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to argue with you.
No.
This is really fascinating. I think about these things a lot.
I've got two things I really need to ask you about, and we've been going for ages, so I need to interrupt. But I want to interject at this point. Listener, please read the book. There's so many questions I've had to skip in my notes because of all the fascinating stuff we've been talking about, which is much better than my questions. But the questions are inspired by all the stuff we haven't covered tonight in the book. So please read the book.
Some of those that work forces.
I want to get back to first question is, if I put back on the lens of quite a let's say fundamentalist evangelical that I was as I was raised, if I heard the phrase ecological conversion, my alarm bells would start ringing, because because that's like a different conversion. It's not the real conversion. So, Anu, could you talk a bit about ecological conversion and maybe take some of the fear out of it that I'm injecting?
Oh my gosh. Yes, please don't be scared of ecological conversion. Oh gosh. Well, if you read Laudato Si, or even if you don't, ecological conversion is not saying that you need to be converted to the environment.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a misnomer.
Mm-hmm.
Ecological conversion is saying that what is it that happens when you understand or come into a relationship with God, and you realize what is in creation and Christ being incarnated into creation, right? Those are sort of the things that are outlined in terms of ecological creation. And one of the things I really like, and I hope this is not the quote you're going to be using,
That's all right.
Andy, but my favorite thing from the documents that talk about ecological conversion is this quote that says, "Our faith tells us that Christ is the center point of human history and creation. All the rich unfolding of the universe and emergences and flowering of life on earth are centered on him. And so the destruction of any part of creation defaces the image of Christ, which is etched in creation." And so what does it mean to be converted, or what does ecological conversion mean? It's in a sense a rededication, I think, to Christ.
Like and a re-understanding of the world.
The rededication to Christ.
Right. And a re-understanding of the world in the light of, like, a deeper understanding of Jesus' incarnation as one of us and part of the world.
The cosmological aspect of the incarnation, right? The Word became flesh and came into the world. All of it is full of God. So the Orthodox theologians talk about panentheism, which is not that like all things are God's, but that God is in everything. God is in all of creation. So it just is this really, I think, a beautiful moment of turning yourself to God. Is what ecological conversion is.
It cleans up this sort of folly of centering everything just like where everything else just becomes a prequel to the real Jesus story, right? So the earth is just a theater play where you think, why did God have to go such a roundabout way that he, created a world and let people do their own things for a few thousand years or maybe millions of years until then Jesus comes. But actually, if all of the entire universe points forward or is read through the incarnation, through the presence of Jesus, then you don't have Logos somehow above coming onto this fake stage or background of nature, but it's actually in it.
I think that's a really, really beautiful idea. And I think that does take the fear out of it. If listener is listening and thinking, but I've already been converted, what is this conversion? Then the answer from me, from what you've said and from the book, would be it's about coming to a deeper understanding of what it means for God to be with us and to be born as one of us and not just one of us humans, but part of us creation.
Yeah, and for Christ to be pre-existent, right?
For that wasn't the beginning
of the universe. Exactly.
Yeah.
But actually part of it the whole time through. Yeah.
I mean, one of the Christian activists that I work with sometimes always says to me that it's actually like when you try to say to anyone else, this is the strangest thing. The incarnation is the strangest thing. It doesn't make sense that a God who's omnipotent has to enflesh their own child. So it has this profound meaning of the fact that Christ is put into creation for a purpose. And it's totally strange.
It's amazing. Okay, cool. Thank you. That's really helpful. So I have to move us on to our next question. Apologies for having some. But so we want to offer some hope through this podcast, one of the possible ways of that is that I know Christian Aid, who you've been working with, are offering a scheme that that people might want to get involved with to find out how to be an activist, or how to do some of this stuff in the real world. So could you tell us a bit about what that is?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for asking. So Christian Aid has something called the Prophetic Activist Scheme. And so if you're interested, if you've got like a passion about climate justice issues, and you feel that you'd like your church to be doing more on this, the Prophetic Activist Scheme is kind of a training scheme. And what it'll provide you are sort of not only tools, but also kind of training, as well as a supportive community that can help you to do that. And so I think it's about like a 6-month scheme. And one of the things that they'll also help you to do is to create a climate justice campaign for your churches. And so there's a lot of things that they offer, like webinars and training residential. There's also like workshops. You also get to work with a mentor. So I've done a little bit of mentorship on it as well, but you've also got like people who are working in churches and who have really good on the ground experience. And it's very much about saying, what kind of vision for climate justice is there in your churches, and how can we take that forward, and what can we do?
Is it a full-time 6 months, or?
It is, no, it's not full. It's not a full time. So you meet with your mentor every so many weeks or so. Okay. So it's not like full time, and so you take them as you are.
You said there's a residential thing. So
there's a residential thing you can sign up for as well. But I would definitely have a check-in on the website and take a look. And you can send any questions that you want as to how you want to do it. And I think some people can do it almost full-time, and some people can do it a bit of part-time as well. So it's a way of really kind of, you also kind of learn some really good activist skills, if that's what you're looking for. So if this is all new to you, it's a good scheme to sign up to. But also if you've been doing this for a long time, but you really need your church to move forward, it gives you a community that can support you to build that, which I think is really important.
Right. So if you're listening and thinking, yeah, but what do I do about it? Maybe this could help.
Definitely. And there's some really good people working on it. Some really young, passionate people.
Fantastic.
Brilliant. And if you're listening to this and you go to St John's Church in Egham, then we'd love someone who isn't us, because we're all
someone young and passionate.
Well, yeah, somebody young and passionate, because we're old and overly busy. We'd love someone to give it a go, and we'd love to support you and help you in that. Definitely.
Yeah. Right, well, Annie, thank you so much for your time, and sorry that we've taken quite so much of your time.
No worries, I'm sorry if I was chuntering about a bit.
No, it's amazing stuff. So we'll repeat again. I'll put links in the show notes, but the book is called Liberation for the Earth, Climate, Race and Cross by Anu Ranawana.
Well done.
Ranawana,
like runner.
Yep. We'll put links in the thing. I highly recommend it. And I also think I want to say, listener, if you're listening to this and it's gone too quickly, which I think to some extent it has for me, then you can obviously listen to it again. But also, if you read the book, take your time, and there's a long way to move in your mind, right? From depending where you start from and where you're going to, but give it some time. Maybe even listen for some rage, and we'd love to hear feedback from you. I was going to read actually part of the bit that you read, Anu, but I've only got part of it written down here, and I actually thought the whole of it was better. So if you can find it again and read the Filipino bishop's quote to us, that would be amazing.
Okay.
Sorry to spring it on you.
That's fine. Okay. Yes, I think I do. I've got notes in front of me. So
thank you.
So this is a quote from a letter that the Filipino Bishops' Conference wrote 30 years ago now, maybe more than 30 years ago now, and it's called "What is Happening to Our Beautiful Land," where they're angry about the extraction and the environmental degradation that they can see around them. And they make this link between Christ and creation, and they say, but our meditation on Jesus goes beyond. Our faith tells us that Christ is the center point of human history and creation. All the rich unfolding of the universe and emergences and flowering of life on earth are centered on him. The destruction of any part of creation, especially the extinction of species, defaces the image of Christ. This image is etched in creation. End quote.
Amazing. And that's from 1988, and it feels very prescient. It's certainly ahead of where a lot of us were in 1988. So pretty amazing. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anu. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, listener.
Thanks, Anu.
Thanks. Goodbye now.
And we'll see you next time.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.